All right, let's get started. It's 6 o'clock, new timing. So, welcome back, everybody, to Product AMA. We are back after a short break to chat again with product leaders. We have a new time, 6 p.m., and we are really looking forward to this new timing. If you're experiencing your first Product AMA, it's a product management community event that Lee Garrison and Mark Silver started a few months ago so that all of us have something to look forward to in our calendars. As soon as the pandemic hit and all the in-person events got canceled, they would start, organizing and hosting this to chat with our favorite product and industry leaders. And I'm really thankful to them for initiating this and having me play a role as a host and an organizer. As an organizer, my name is Rhythm. To those of you who don't know me, I am a recent MBA graduate from the Schulich School of Business, and prior to that, I've worked as a product manager in India in the digital, automotive, and media industry. Um, okay, I'll start off the AMA by asking a couple of questions to our guest. And everyone attending the AMA is free to ask their questions to our guest in the Zoom chat or the YouTube comments, and we'll take them up one by one. We're also recording this session, and we'll be posting the recording shortly after our session on YouTube. And to get in touch with us, it's best to message us directly on Twitter or LinkedIn, whether you want to give us feedback, propose a new topic, or want to invite a product or industry leader on Product AMA. So feel free to reach out to us. And you can also reach out to either me, Mark, or Lee directly on LinkedIn. All right, let's get started. Our topic for today is navigating product redesigns. And to tell us all about it, we are joined by Avrum Laurie, who is the VP of Product at WealthSimple. Avrum has led product at Microsoft and FreshBooks prior to joining WealthSimple, and all of us know WealthSimple very well. Avrum, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience and tell us one interesting unknown fact about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Avrum. Just for a little bit of context about me, I grew up in Toronto. I went to school in Toronto at U of T, actually, for engineering. Started my career, as Rhythm mentioned, at Microsoft in Seattle. So I lived out in the States for a couple years. But I ultimately decided to move back because it was really important for me to kind of build my career here and invest in the tech community here. The brain drain is kind of was and is a real thing. And it always baffles me because it's like, we build products on the internet. Like, why does it matter where we're geographically located? Why can't Canada be, world-class? And I believe it is. So it was really important for me to move back, focused on kind of working with startups, and that startups that happen to be incidentally in the money space, accounting, and now fintech with WealthSimple. Coincidentally, I have like zero background in finance, and it's just you end up working where you end up. And I guess the fun fact about me is I started playing violin when I was 4 years old. I continued until I was around 19, and then I started engineering, and then I never picked it up again. So maybe that's my fun/depressing fact.
Awesome. Well, maybe we'll get to hear some of that in the near future. All right, let's get started off with the AMA. So, Aaron, my first question that I would like to ask you is about making that, since our topic is navigating product redesign. So, making that first step towards a redesign, the actual decision of doing a revamp. So, what are some of the cues or triggers that lead to embarking upon this journey of a product revamp?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess one thing I would say is that I don't think that there's really a single cue or trigger, because it really depends on it's kind of circumstantial, and it depends on the product you're dealing with, the technology you're dealing with. But let me maybe provide sort of two examples of two instances where I went through a product redesign and what the cues were in those cases. And then I might try and generalize a little bit, maybe some some, kind of more universal triggers that you can look for. The first one was FreshBooks, where, I led the redesign of basically, we basically rebuilt FreshBooks from the ground up. And the original impetus of that redesign actually was technology related, which was that, FreshBooks has, it's kind of like, the oldest startup. It's been around since like just after the dot-com bust, started in 2003. And so it was built on, a lot of founder code before, modern web frameworks and before a lot of the technologies that, really have matured since they were founded. And so what we found is that basically, development was really, effectively had sort of ground to a halt. Because, things that would be easy for other companies were really hard for us. Like I remember it took us, it was 4 months or something to like, to ship, pretty URLs, like URLs that actually made sense because our URLs were just like nonsense characters that were like super confusing. Now that is something you get out of the box with a modern web framework, but it's something that took us, 4 to 6 months to deliver. And so things like that, really were slowing us down. But when we looked into like, evolving sort of the technology, we realized that a lot of the complexity of the technology manifested itself in the user experience. Like the two were inextricably linked. And so you couldn't just like improve the user experience, improve the technology and leave the user experience as it was. The two were just so linked. And so what we ultimately realized was that like we really needed to rethink the technology alongside the user experience at once. And so that was while the impetus was really like really like dealing with a legacy technology that we didn't really feel like could get us where we needed to go. The realization we came to is that we actually had to redesign the whole app. And not doing that wouldn't actually yield the kind of efficiency gains that we actually sought from an engineering perspective. So that was the FreshBooks example. From the WealthSimple perspective, the impetus was very specific to what WealthSimple is. And for those who may not be familiar with WealthSimple is, basically a suite of online tools to help you kind of grow your wealth. So online investing, now tax filing, online saving, and more. And so the impetus there was really related to our investment products, and it was a market downturn. So WealthSimple was founded, during the longest bull run in history, starting in 2009, and it's unclear if it's ended yet. So WealthSimple has never known really a significant market, prolonged market downturn, a recession. And so in Q4 of, I think it was Q4 of 2018, actually, there was, I think it was like the worst December since the Great Depression in terms of like, losses in the markets. And what we realized during that period is that our application was really not set up to handle the emotions and the impulses that our clients felt very naturally when suddenly the market dips, 20% or whatever it was. And that's, not because we were sort of derelict in our engineering or our design, but rather because we had only known kind of like the good times. And then we hadn't really sort of future-proofed the user experience to deal with the economic certainty that, the good times will eventually end and you will have, a contraction. It's a necessary and an inevitable part of the economic cycle. And so that was really the impetus there, is that, customers were anxious, they were concerned, they were depositing less money when really, that isn't actually the right behavior if you're really saving for your future. And so, experiencing that really sort of was a bit of a wake up call for us to really take on an ambitious redesign. And so if I were to like distill some of these, some of these themes, I guess, is, one thing that I've observed, and this was true in the FreshBooks case, is that product and technology tends to kind of grow organically over time. You can be as deliberate and conscious about the way you grow your technology as you want, but the fact of the matter is that, to some degree, it's going to be organic, and organic growth is often, with enough time, leads to kind of unmanageable complexity. A state where the system has become so complicated that you really have to take a step back and stop making and incremental tweaks and optimizations can no longer really get you where you need to go, and you ultimately ultimately need to consider a redesign. Redesign might not be your solution, by the way, but that unmanageable complexity is really an opportunity to take a step back and consider whether it's the right time. The second thing is a deep-rooted or systemic problem that is not isolated to any one feature or any one experience, but is pervasive across your entire experience. Because if it's localized to one part of the experience, you can fix it with a targeted solution. If it's pervasive, if it's like manifests itself kind of everywhere, then really you have to think about something more holistic. And I would say WealthSimple was an example of that, insofar as like no part of the app really prepared the user for the inevitability of a market downturn. And so this represented like a really pervasive and non-localized problem that we ultimately had to address.
Awesome. And I really liked what you mentioned earlier about technology and user experience flowing in together when revamping a product. And if I understand it correctly, if the user behavior changes across the board, it's time, and it gets complicated, it's time for revamping a product, which I believe we might see right now, or after the pandemic that we're living in right now.
Products.
Yeah.
I think that what's going to, in the current climate that we're in, you're going to expose a lot of problems that probably were there before, but probably didn't have this sort of the acute impact that they have today in the current climate. Like no one's going, I don't think anyone's going to, or few people are making their way to a branch of their bank, right? And so the problems with online banking that probably existed for years are now felt much more acutely. Now, to just be clear, that the fact that you have these problems doesn't necessarily mean that you necessarily need to undertake an overhaul or a full redesign. Just know that there's a lot of risk that comes with redesigns. In some cases, you can really be jeopardizing, what's working, and so you got to really take these endeavors with consider them very thoughtfully and very carefully.
For sure. We do have questions around risks that we come to later. But let's move ahead and ask you another question around when it comes to proposing a redesign to the team. The idea can flow in from anywhere from the senior leadership to be the product team itself. So how can product managers or leaders create an effective and convincing narrative for their teams and stakeholders when dealing with revamps or proposing a revamp?
Sure. I think a couple different ways come to mind. One is, I think what's really important, first and foremost, is articulating the problem that you're trying to solve. So, like a redesign is a solution looking for a problem, right? And if you pitch a redesign, I kind of guarantee that 999 times out of 1,000 you will fail, because no one wants to do a redesign, because, like, again, why am I doing a redesign? It feels like it's cosmetic. Sorry, I have a dog, and so you may hear him bark from time to time. It feels like it's cosmetic. It feels like it's maybe it's self-indulgent, just to redesign for the sake of redesign, because, like, hey, we like to build new shiny things. And so really start by articulating the problem clearly. What is the problem that we are ultimately trying to solve with a redesign? And also answer the question, why is it a redesign is what's necessary to answer that, to solve that problem? And what are the dimensions of this redesign? Like, is it actually a replatforming where you're actually rebuilding the product from the ground, from scratch? Are you actually just like, changing sort of like the the user interface, but fundamentally the product is like remaining the same. Like the scope and scale of the redesign is also important to articulate, so folks understand what they're kind of getting into. And look, in the process of articulating the problem and articulating the potential solutions, one of which could be redesign, you might realize that a redesign is not what you should pursue, and that's a good outcome too, right? Because no one wants to build the wrong thing, especially when that thing is as large in scope and scale as a redesign can be. So the second thing I would probably advise in order to sort of to develop this effective, convincing narrative is to capture the imagination, which is like demonstrate the art of the possible. Like show your stakeholders what could be, and like if it's 5 exemplar screens that represent like a new and different world than before. Once you've clearly articulated the problem, do that. I think the reality is if you propose something like too abstract, it can be really hard to get buy-in. But likewise, if you propose, like 1,000 mock-ups, this fully fleshed out solution, that has every corner case and edge case, that's like also not really capturing the imagination either. It's like, it's actually completely overwhelming. So I think you want to like articulate what could be. And, maybe these experiences that you're articulating, you're describing are not even necessarily shippable. Like there's problems in there that you haven't solved yet. And that's fine. Like defer that complexity for later. And, that's future use problem. The goal at the outset is to basically see like, hey, here's how much better the experience could be at solving the problem that, you've defined. And I guess the last thing I'd say maybe is no one likes a monolith. And so try to break down, even if you're talking about a, fulsome, redesign, figure out a way to break it down into an incremental series of steps. Because like a monolithic endeavor implies monolithic risk, and monolithic risk is terrifying, and it should be terrifying because it's self-evident. It's monolithic risk. And so if you can break it down into a series of incremental steps, then you can also decompose the risk into a series of incremental risks that you can progressively sort of like de-risk through progressive validation. And look, in the end, you might actually, end up with a complete sort of redesign, but you got there incrementally. And that incrementally doesn't necessarily mean you're doing it screen at a time. That's one way of breaking it down, but there's all different kinds of ways of turning a monolith into something incremental. You could basically start with a small group of users, or start with a subset of new users, but basically like avoid a scenario where what you're pitching is, and then we do a hard cut, and suddenly all your users are on a new experience on from day 1 to day 2, and because that's terrifying. It's terrifying for the business because it implies that again, that monolithic risk that you want to really avoid.
All right, those are some great insights. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, and I would encourage people who have just joined us to ask their questions to Avrum in the Zoom chat or in the YouTube comments. So we have a follow-up question from Lee. He says, "I love the idea of the vision and inspiring the team with what that could be. Should there be some business case, and if so, how do you quantify the benefit, or is it just primarily reducing risks?"
Sorry, could I just get a little clarification there? Quantify the business case for what? For the redesign?
For the redesign and setting up the, so basically the narrative, as you mentioned, should be around the vision of the product. So right. If there's a redesign investment being made, should there be some kind of business case around it, and the benefit should be quantified, or is it just primarily reducing risks?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that I think there's probably instances where you can build a business case, and again, it's probably going to be product specific, context specific. So I'll give you a concrete example from Wealthsimple. Is that what we noticed is during periods of like extreme volatility, when markets were taking a nosedive in a very short period of time, we noticed that the subsequent impact would be that our clients would save about half as much. They contribute about half as much because they're frightened, right? They're like, I don't want to throw, from their perspective, and although this is a fallacy, it's a completely understandable one. I don't want to throw good money after bad. Well, suddenly seeing our net deposits, which is the way they contribute to their portfolio, decrease by half, has a pretty substantial impact not only on their future savings, but also the way that Wealthsimple makes money. And so in that case, you can actually probably create a fairly clear business case that if we can help our clients ultimately stick to the plan, even when there's periods of short-term volatility, the client's interests are actually aligned with Wealthsimple's interests, and we could demonstrate that through a business model. But I think it's going to be it's going to be case specific because it's not always that straightforward. As I mentioned in the FreshBooks case, being able to quantify developer efficiency and then project out what that efficiency will yield in terms of increased throughput and therefore its impact on the business, that's super hard. And there's other, intangibles that come with with replatforming, as we did. Hey, you can hire developers who are familiar with modern tech stacks, whereas previously we, had to look for certain kinds of developers who are generalists that could basically, work, on, frameworkless PHP. And so those intangibles are really hard to quantify. And so I guess that's more so about, that's more so a question of risk, but I think it's going to be a really case-by-case basis.
All right. And there's another question in the chat. Are there other kinds of technical debt that drive a redesign?
Other kinds of technical debt that drive a redesign?
Yeah.
Well, I think in the FreshBooks case, I kind of gave an example of technical debt where, where there was an extreme amount of technical debt that, ultimately kind of motivated us to kind of simplify the user experience and also the business logic, and therefore, therefore the technology. So, I mean, I guess that's like a generic catch-all for the technical debt side. I mean, I think there's other kinds of debts you accrue over time, like design debt, for example. Like when I talk about organic growth, like one of the things that we observed, I've observed every time I've embarked on any kind of a redesign is you end up with an organic proliferation of design of patterns, different ways of solving the same scenario, basically of doing the same thing. So, different ways of presenting information to users or getting the user's consent to do something. And this organic proliferation basically means that you end up with a hodgepodge of different ways of accomplishing, again, what is essentially the same thing. So that's a kind of, debt that you can accrue over time. And the problem with that kind of debt is that having so many ways of accomplishing effectively what is effectively the same thing effectively means that the user has to basically relearn how to do something over and over and over again, because on every unique user experience pattern you provide, it's like a new system they have to figure out. Whereas if you rationalize all that, which you can do in the context of a redesign, you have the benefit of a truly rationalized set of patterns where the user basically learns once and then suddenly knows how to basically use all facets of your application, which is really, really useful if, for example, you're going to launch a second product. Well, if a user actually already knows how to use your first product and you've been able to adopt the same sort of design standards in your next product, well, guess what? They already know how to use your next product. And that has a huge benefit for cross-sell and, for increasing adoption. So I guess technical debt is not the only kind of debt. Design debt would be another kind. There's also product debt. So, for example, you may have built features into your experience that, frankly, are just like not don't have significant adoption and actually just add complexity to the overall experience. And so, a redesign is an opportunity to also just like retire some of those things and basically say, like, we can actually retire some of the debt we've accrued over time, because honestly, there isn't a strong use case for these things. The one thing I will warn is, every time you do that, the folks who do use them will come out of the woodwork, and that's not to diminish them, because for some very small subset of users, those features are really important and really meaningful. So while it may be the right decision, it's important to acknowledge that it won't feel like the important decision for some of your users, and that's important to be empathetic to when you're talking to them.
Awesome. And there's a question by Victor in the chat. He's asking that, how do you approach change management with users as you roll out the new design? Change can be frustrating to some people.
Yeah. So I guess what I'd say is, if you're embarking on a redesign where you're going to change things, your best bet is to expect that initially the users you hear from will not like it. And that's because even if it's objectively better, like even if you could prove this user experience is 10 times more efficient, and which is like pretty hard to do, because like oftentimes the measure of a user experience isn't necessarily that it's more efficient. It maybe evokes better emotions, or all different kinds of dimensions in terms of evaluating the quality of a user experience. But even if let's say you could prove deterministically that this is a better user experience, it doesn't matter, because it's change and people hate change, right? Every single time that Facebook has changed their interface, people have hated it. But that is the story of, that's like just the most notable example, but that's the story of literally every redesign. When Gmail came out with Inbox, it was, if you recall, it was like an opt-in to Inbox initially, it was like an opt-out, like they automatically opted you in, you had to explicitly opt out. People hated it. So you have to prepare for that. That is going to be the default reaction, no matter what. And that honestly can take a bit of a toll on you as a product manager, as a designer, as anyone involved in building the new user experience, because you're like, hey, we did this in a well-intentioned in a well-intentioned spirit and to accomplish problems, and yet all we're hearing is why it's wrong. So first of all, it's just something that you need to anticipate and prepare for. In terms of managing change, a couple things that I could suggest. One is, it is important to explain the rationale of your changes to your customers. Not all customers will engage in that rationale. We'll read your blog post or see your videos, or we'll go through your tutorial, but it is important to explain the rationale and to sort of treat the users as sort of equals on the journey, which is like, they deserve to understand the rationale for why something that they have come to like or come to love even is changing. From their perspective, there may not be a problem. Like, what was broken? Why did you need to solve it? So it's important to be forthright with the rationale. Not everyone's going to engage in it, but that's important. The second thing I'd say is like just progressive validation as you're designing it with your existing users, to show them the new experience, to get their feedback, to get their thoughts. And look, even if you do tons of that sort of progressive validation, you're still not going to necessarily get everything right and please everybody, and that's okay. And I guess the last thing is, once you're ready to release, like, I think one of the things that I've experienced as sort of softening the blow is, even if ultimately you're going to move everyone onto this new experience, allowing users to engage at their own pace is valuable, because it means that they don't have to switch their workflow or abandon the product that they know how to use and perhaps even love on your timetable. They have the opportunity to try it when they're ready to try it, when they have some time, kick the tires, maybe give some feedback, maybe even revert for a time to the old experience before they're ready to take the plunge. But allowing the user to operate on their own timetable is it takes a lot of the pressure off the user to basically buy in on day one. And so it won't solve all your problems, but it will alleviate things. And also it potentially makes the engineering challenge a little more complicated, because you have to give the ability for people to live in both worlds for a time, which, is going to increase the complexity of the build. But often it's a worthwhile trade-off in order, again, to not enforce a timetable on users.
Awesome. I really like the fact that you mentioned about testing it out, especially in B2B products, partnering with a couple of clients to help them use the interface, and then maybe increase the adoption across the board. So we're at the halfway mark, and we're getting a lot of other questions as well. This one from Keith on YouTube. He's asking that, what was your approach to the redesign at WealthSimple to ensure that you are effectively solving problems that you identified with the users?
I think that the way we approached it is, by applying sort of a design thinking methodology. Now, design thinking is just a fancy term for the scientific method. It's effectively what you're doing, which is, you start by understanding the problem space through research, right? Talking to customers, looking at data, and then synthesizing a set of problems and insights, which are then well-defined. Then sort of identifying potential solutions. And that could be anything from sketching, different potential solutions, to creating clickable prototypes, to anything in between. To creating a testable hypothesis out of one of those potential solutions, which is to say, if we approach a design, that has these attributes, we should see the following, either reactions or behaviors from our customers, and then actually performing the validation of that hypothesis by running a test. So we did that a number of times. Across a number of different problems that we identified. So let me give you a concrete example from that redesign and how we applied, the sort of that scientific method, that design thinking methodology. So one of the things that we found is that a sudden dip in the markets, causes a lot of anxiety, because in the previous design, one of the problems was we didn't provide any context around performance. Everything was point in time. Your portfolio is down 20%. Your portfolio is up 5%. Your portfolio is down -1%. It was all point in time information. So the problem was we were providing point in time information on your portfolio, but with zero context to explain that point in time performance. So one of the solutions we came up with was providing historical context around that performance. So as an example, if you look at a sudden dip in the markets over a longer time horizon, like if you've been an investor for 2 years and there's a sudden dip in the markets, that dip does not look so scary, because looking back, you've seen, hey, I've been up and down many times before, and I've always recovered, because in general, markets go up, give it enough time. And so providing an additional context helps you sort of, our hypothesis was providing that additional context would help you be more at ease and panic less in the moment. Okay. So that was our hypothesis. That was the solution we came up with. And so we ran, some tests with users where we would show them, a portfolio. We say, let's imagine you're waking up on a Monday and you're logging into your portfolio, and we would stress test a really scary scenario, like a sudden market dip. And we'd ask them a series of questions that was aiming to either validate or invalidate our hypothesis. Describe what you're seeing here. How does it make you feel? And we basically had defined some criteria for what success or failure would look like based on the answers that they provided. And so, that, among other things, ultimately helped us validate that we were indeed on the right track. That wasn't the only kind of context we ultimately provided. but it was an example of how we sort of live that sort of design thinking methodology to validate that we were indeed solving a problem with our new redesign.
Awesome. That's great to hear. So earlier you touched briefly upon, looking at whether this experience is good or not, whether the new design is great for our users or not. So I believe there's a lot of ambiguity around, new designs and product revamps. So how should product managers deal with that sort of ambiguity when it comes to designing a new interface or experience?
I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but I think the ambiguity arises when you don't have a clearly defined problem. When your goal is, I want to redesign my application, then, I mean, that's the most ambiguous thing I can imagine, because your solution space is infinite, right? It's like you could solve every single problem ever. And so that is a daunting task. And so the way to basically eliminate ambiguity is to get really precise about the problem you're trying to solve or set of problems you're trying to solve, which requires sort of a deep analysis and synthesis of all the data that you're at your disposal, talking to customers, looking at your quantitative data, and hopefully synthesizing that into a set of very clear problems, right? And then oftentimes validating even those problems, because maybe even before that, once you've synthesized a problem, you can actually go and talk to customers and say, hey, have I articulated this problem correctly? Have I done it in a way that feels authentic to you? Because sometimes your synthesis and your problem definition is wrong. It's you've interpreted the data the wrong way. And so, your solutions might be valid, but your problem's invalid. And so that's, to me, the most important way to really reduce the ambiguity, is to get to really precise problem statement. Yeah.
All right. And we also briefly discussed that when it comes to testing the revamp or testing the new design with the users, you can maybe partner up with a couple of clients in the B2B setting. But apart from that, how different is such a redesign for a B2B product versus a B2C product?
That's really interesting, because the two sort of major examples that I've worked on span kind of both domains. FreshBooks is B2B. It's not enterprise, but it's B2 small business, and certainly WealthSimple is B2C. I actually did a smaller scale redesign at Microsoft that was more so kind of, again, in the B2C, in the B2 prosumer space, I guess, B2P, I don't know, but somewhere in between. So I think there's been a range. So there's some interesting differences that you have to consider. And one is that in the B2B space, when you, a redesign is going to be disruptive to your customer no matter what, no matter who they are, no matter the context. But in a B2B space, there's potentially an impact on the bottom line. You're actually potentially disrupting somebody's day-to-day workflow and making it so they can't earn as much money because they have to learn your new software. And, that's really disruptive, especially to a B2B business. An example of a company that's really leaned into to that reality is Basecamp. It's one of the reasons why Basecamp has discrete versions. They have Basecamp 1, Basecamp 2, Basecamp 3 is what they have effectively said is look, you are you're fundamentally doing harm to somebody's business when you require them to learn effectively new software because you've chosen to do a redesign. So what they've said is, we're going to create discrete versions of our software, even though it's cloud-based and it's a SaaS product. They're going to actually treat it almost like it's box software, and either a customer can choose to opt into the new product. They can say, "Hey, I want to try the latest Basecamp, and I want to do that." Or alternatively, they can stick with what they're comfortable with. But all new customers, all new growth is on the new platform. And if you think about a startup context, that makes a lot of sense because for almost every startup, your growth is really ahead of you, right? I mean, startups want to, double, triple their customer bases every year. And so, you really want to take care of your legacy customers because they're the folks who've got you to where you are today. But, you can really make the primary customer of the new platform, your new customers, because they haven't known something else. And so you haven't really set any expectations with them. And so, they can benefit from, the latest and greatest. We took a similar approach to that at FreshBooks, where we strongly encouraged users to migrate to the new platform when we released it. But we gave them the ability to, first of all, opt in and even opt out. And to be clear, it wasn't a perfect solution. It still caused a certain amount of disruption to folks' businesses, particularly when the migration experience either back and forth wasn't perfect, and folks are much less forgiving of bugs in a context like this, and I totally understand why, because you're talking about somebody's livelihood. But it does at least give somebody peace of mind and comfort to know that, like, look, if it's really a question of my livelihood, I always can have an escape hatch to basically revert to the previous context. That is less of a concern in the B2C context. I'm not saying that people won't feel disruptive and that we don't need to be empathetic to those concerns, but you aren't jeopardizing the same thing. You aren't jeopardizing somebody's, in general, in the B2C context, you aren't jeopardizing something as important as like somebody's livelihood.
All right. And we have a question here from Catherine. She's asking that in her team, they break down goals for our next redesign into now, next, or later to help share the dream while also making the redesign seem feasible as the first increment. How far to how far they should go with illustrating the future or that big lofty dream in terms of investing in the fidelity of design presentation?
Right. It's a good question. I mean, I think that, like, in order to justify a redesign, you have to go, in my opinion, by the way, I think that there's probably lots of people who disagree with me here. And reasonable people can disagree about this. So I just want to state that, is that in my experience, like, you actually have to go further in terms of the vision of your redesign than that first release, which is to say, like, you have to justify, why you're going to take on such a significant investment. And often you're not going to, if you just literally constrained your vision to V1, people wouldn't see that vision. They wouldn't see what this redesign unlocks for you. Like, by doing this redesign, there's all these new opportunities that are unlocked for us as a business that were previously prohibited for some reason, or really, really hard to execute. And so if you really constrain, the ideation and too early, and you present this to your stakeholders, you're like, look at what this redesign unlocks, and it's really like a lean MVP. I don't think you're actually going to justify the investment, and I think that would be a fair response from those folks, because they may not see the potential of what your redesign ultimately unlocks. So my feeling is, like, I often advise my folks to, like, think long and short at the same time, which is like demonstrate the vision of where you want to go. Not in terms of figuring out every single, like, corner case and edge case, but, like, show what is unlocked by this redesign, what the potential it is. But then also show, how we could get there incrementally. What does step one look like? But I think you actually need both, especially when you're trying to like justify and rationalize really an investment as large as a redesign.
All right. And so Keith on YouTube, he's asking a follow-up question. He says, thanks, Avrum. As a follow-up, how did you handle testing multiple different hypotheses at the same time leading up to the launch of the redesign? Were these parallel research streams?
Yeah, I actually think one thing that's really important as part of like a design thinking process is don't converge too early. And I think you really need to basically ensure that you don't fall in love with your first hypothesis, your first solution. You actually need to go pretty divergent and pretty bold earlier on in order to make sure that you're really like exploring sort of what's possible. I think all too often, like we do fall in love with our first ideas because we think they're really great. But I think as a result, we miss out on, we miss out on some hidden gold that may be less obvious. So what we did is we actually came up with a number of different hypotheses. They weren't necessarily conflicting hypotheses, to be clear. It's not like one was at odds with another, but it was that they were very, very different, right? They tried to solve the same problem in different ways. And again, not necessarily in conflict, but different. And then what we tried to do is come up with several different designs several different designs that reflected these hypotheses in like their purest form. So like I mentioned an example where we tried to like sort of address people's insecurities about point in time portfolio performance by showing historical context. Like, hey, look, your portfolio has been up and down before, so there's no need to panic right now. Because like you've lived through this before, and hey, you made it to the other side. So like you can, that's a reassuring thing. But there was another hypothesis we came up with, which is like, hey, what if instead of focusing on point of time, we focus on the future? So basically, we can project out, to some reasonable amount of certainty, what we think you're going to have in 30 years, right? We can say like, hey, if you keep investing the amount that you've been investing every month, you'll have this amount in the future. And so our hypothesis there was, hey, a sudden dip in the market doesn't affect our projections out into the future because it actually, in general, over a long period of time, shouldn't really affect your outcomes, right? Like a sudden dip really is immaterial in the context of a 30, 40-year investment. So we came up with two designs that were like, again, not at odds, but were like the purest, sort of manifestation of a focus on historical context and the purest manifestation of a focus on the long-term future. And guess what? They both actually proved they had a role in the overall redesign. And so our end design actually combined them. And so that's actually the benefit of going divergent and testing multiple parallel hypotheses, is that actually sometimes you hit on gold and you actually can combine the best of both worlds of your like purest designs. And you can actually see that in the app. We have like when you log in, we show a historical context. When you click on an account, we actually show you what we project you'll have in the future. So we actually combine some of these ideas into something that was like greater than the sum of their parts.
That is awesome. And that's really insightful and good to learn about. So we're almost at the hour mark, and please feel free to ask any other questions that you might have in the chat. Avrum, we talked a lot about defining the vision, going further with the vision rather than just the design. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me of an old quote by Peter Drucker that what gets measured gets managed. I wanted to understand from your perspective, how do you set goals for your redesign, and how do these evolve as your product evolves?
Right. It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that again, the measures that you define to basically evaluate success are going to be directly related to the problem that you uncovered, right? And so that problem is going to be, specific to the particular circumstance. But if you can identify and articulate the problem, then you can articulate how you would determine if that problem has been lessened, right? Or in worst case, made worse. But I think that the measurement needs to emerge from that original problem or set of problems. And so it's going to be, again, specific to the particular use case. There are, of course, like a set of generic measures that are going to make sense in in the context of any redesign, like let's say you have an opt-in, to try the new experience, you're going to want to understand like your funnel there, which is like how many people choose to opt in, how many people revert, and those kind of like basic funnel metrics that you're going to do to assess the health of your metrics. And likewise, you're going to want to use customers' feedback and customer sentiment as a way of like evaluating the success or failure again of your redesign. That is again, let's just an important sort of fairly generic tool that you should also have at your disposal. I would say a few things, which is like it's easy in the context of a redesign to get discouraged if the results don't materialize on day one. But I would say a few things there. If your only acceptable outcome was to be perfect on day one, then the task at hand was impossible in the first place, because like the nature of anything has to be iterative learning and iterative experimentation. And so A, don't be discouraged. B, you'll always hear from the squeaky wheel. The customers, who are most vocal will be the ones who are generally displeased or unhappy. That doesn't mean I'm not saying that to diminish their feedback, but it basically means that like we as humans are just like wired to pay more attention to negative feedback than positive feedback. And a lot of the feedback you will hear is, a lot of the good feedback you will hear is actually the absence of negative feedback, which is people are like, I'm happy with this redesign. I mean, like, I don't know, when is the last time, I would ask everyone on this call, you proactively sent somebody, a software company that you use, like positive feedback on a redesign that they had? Like, I'm sure we've all probably given negative feedback on a redesign that we didn't like, but when did we last proactively provide feedback on one we liked? It's just not something that we tend to do. And again, as humans, we're just not even wired to take it as seriously, even in the rare instances when we do, as when we hear negative feedback. So it's something to just consider. I guess the other thing to be mindful of is that generally, as I mentioned, like the redesign is as much about like the immediate gains you hope to get from that redesign as it is about the potential that you hope to unlock from that redesign, which may not be materialized on day one, but you're setting yourself up for a future capability, a future a piece of value that wasn't previously possible in the old world. So again, it's not necessarily all about the results on day one, but about that, that future you've unlocked for yourselves, in the months and years to come, that wouldn't have been possible, that would have been prohibitive if you hadn't engaged in that redesign.
All right. We have another audience question from Girish. Earlier, we spoke a lot about testing and getting feedback from beta users. So he asks, for business like WealthSimple, product release is rolled out to typically how many beta users in terms of numbers or percentages?
I mean, it really depends. It basically depends on what you're trying to do and why. If effectively you're using your beta pool to like work out operational kinks and fix bugs, and do like a very sort of base level of sort of sanity test that things are working as expected, you probably want to keep that relatively small. If your goal is to like solicit like a feedback on an experience, you probably want to make sure you get critical mass of engaged users who are actually like using the product on a regular basis. And so it's like, it's not only important how many, but it's like who you're targeting with that beta program, like folks who are likely to give you feedback because they're like heavier users, more passionate, devoted users of your product. But it's really going to depend on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes a particular product or feature or whatever is super high risk. And so you want to really constrain that risk until you've really proven it out. Like maybe this is sometimes the case in WealthSimple, but like the particular feature introduces like a new fraud vector. Like, the feature can be abused. And so you want to basically understand that abuse at smaller scale, or that potential abuse at smaller scale, before, really opening the floodgates and opening up your company to like, significant risk. So it's really going to be case dependent. I can say that like, one funny, interesting, I guess, anecdote from my FreshBooks days is we initially launched the new FreshBooks, which is the redesign, under a different brand. And we like incorporated like a fake company, basically. And the goal there was that we wanted to actually test out the functionality, that we had delivered as early as possible, well before it would have made any sense to an existing customer, because it was a sliver of the functionality that was supported in the existing product. But we couldn't wait until we replicated a product that was 10 years old. We couldn't, right? But likewise, if we showed this like very, 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 very thin, lean product to our existing customers, they'd be super confused. They'd be like, what the heck are you guys doing? You're rebuilding a 10th, a 20th of the functionality that exists. So we launched it as like this completely under this new brand, to basically net new customers who had no expectations, over, what functionality they would get. And that was an opportunity for us to basically get it in front of customers in a kind of a safe, insular way. It's kind of an interesting anecdote. It's a rare thing to do something like that. And it has its own set of challenges that I'm happy to go into. But, I guess what I would say is it really depends on what you're trying to learn.
Yeah, that reminds me. So I was talking to a product manager from Google who leads Gmail, and they used inbox.google.com for testing out features. So building a parallel environment just to test out features or do experiments on their users. So that's a great example. Thank you for that, Avrum. We do have a comment for you from YouTube. Keith is saying that as a side note, I do miss the future forecast view on the WealthSimple dashboard across all accounts. Right. So that's a comment for you. Last question, Avrum, before we sign off. Product managers are always striving to learn more about product management, their users, and you are at a senior leader position right now. But how do you keep learning going in your profession?
I guess I think that the nature of product managers is that we try to maintain a certain like naivete throughout our entire careers. And so what I mean by that is like we approach everything from first principles as though we know nothing. Because a lot of the times we don't know anything because we're working in a domain that we're completely unfamiliar with. But that first principles thinking is the best way to learn, because not only does it help you engage with a new domain or a new concept at the most elemental level, so that you like understand it from its most basic building blocks. It also helps you like actually be disruptive, because it's only with like such a naive lens can you actually say like, hey, this is like completely broken. We could simplify this. Incredibly. And I think that naive mindset, it's like, I call it like sort of like a naive first principles, rigorous mindset. That's like a terrible expression because it's like so wordy, but that's what I'm trying to get at is like, I think that's how you just stay, you basically like maintain a learning mindset. And I will say that like, sure, I have a senior sounding title, but like I find that I learn so much every day just by taking on this super naive mindset, and engage with things as though I'm the most junior person in the room. And I think that's like really important, and it can be a little bit scary because we all have egos and we all want to seem like we know what we're doing. And you have to kind of be a little bit vulnerable to basically be like, hey, I have no idea what you're talking about. Can you explain it to me in like the most basic terms possible? But honestly, that vulnerability is super important, because otherwise, I think you're just missing an opportunity to learn a ton.
Stay curious. That's how I would summarize what you just said.
Absolutely.
All right. Yeah. So this is amazing. Thank you so much, Avrum, for all those insights and anecdotes. And thank you for joining us on Product AMA today. And thank you everyone else who joined us in the audience. Thank you so much for tuning in. And please help us spread the word of Product AMA and share any feedback that you might have about the session today with us on maybe Twitter or LinkedIn. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow. We have another AMA session at 6 p.m. When we are talking with Jay Jutkowitz about being the product manager of your own career. That's an interesting topic. And you can find the registration and Zoom details on LinkedIn and also on Twitter. So tune to join, just visit our LinkedIn or Twitter pages at Product AMA. And Avrum, thank you again for joining us today. It's been a pleasure hosting you. We really appreciate it. And everyone, take care, stay safe, have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. It's fun.
Thank you.